understanding is that we've really got a wide range of participants in this webinar, both geographically and in terms of familiarity with key biodiversity areas. So my plan for the presentation is to start by giving a fairly high-level background on what are KBAs, or what KBAs are. Then I'll provide an overview of the KBA standard before going into the KBA guidelines. So starting first with the high-level background on key biodiversity areas. So as I'm sure you're all very well aware, biodiversity loss is occurring at an alarming rate in terrestrial, freshwater and marine systems. An effective action to address this biodiversity loss depends in part on knowing which species are most at risk. And at the global level, the IUCN Red List has proven a valuable tool for identifying species at risk of extinction. But across all biodiversity, a species-by-species approach is not always the most efficient, especially where habitat destruction or degradation at particular sites underpins threats to multiple species or other elements of biodiversity. So in this context, effective action to address biodiversity loss also depends on knowing which areas in the world contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity so that we can safeguard those sites. And that's why the Convention on Biological Diversity recognized the need to conserve areas of particular importance for biodiversity in its Aichi Target 11. However, there are many different approaches to identifying important sites for biodiversity. So many of you will be familiar with hotspots and ecoregions, and those provide regional priorities. But globally, most conservation action actually occurs at the site scale. And BirdLife International's success at identifying and conserving important bird areas has led to similar approaches being developed for other taxonomic groups, with some modifications to the criteria. So for example, we have prime butterfly areas, important plant areas, etc. However, overlapping sites identified using different criteria for different species can end up being quite confusing for decision makers. And so at the World Conservation Congress in Bangkok in 2004, IUCN members recognized the need for a unified framework for identifying important sites across all biodiversity. So after an extensive consultation process, 11 of the world's leading nature conservation organizations launched a new partnership to identify, map, monitor, and conserve key biodiversity areas at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016, and several new partners have joined since then, so this is no longer a complete set of partners. So key biodiversity areas, or KBAs, provide an umbrella framework designed to harmonize existing approaches to the identification of important sites for biodiversity. KBAs are defined as sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity, and they are identified using globally standardized criteria and quantitative thresholds designed to ensure that the process is objective, repeatable, and transparent. The criteria are designed to capture elements of biodiversity across genetic, species, and ecosystem levels, and are applicable to marine, freshwater, terrestrial, and subterranean systems. KBA identification and delineation is a nationally driven bottom-up process. And it's important to emphasize here that identification of a site as a KBA simply recognizes that site as important for the global persistence of biodiversity. It does not imply that any specific conservation action, such as protected area designation, is required. And in many cases, these sites are already well conserved through formal protection or otherwise. And where KBAs are threatened, then decisions about management action should be based on national or local prioritization processes, which combine data on the site's importance for biodiversity with data on site vulnerability and other relevant factors, such as cultural values. Nevertheless, identification of sites as KBAs will in its own right contribute to their conservation in two main ways. First of all, information on the location of KBAs and biodiversity they contain is made publicly available through the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. So governments and others can use this information to support spatial planning, conservation priority setting, and the strategic expansion of protected area networks. global conservation funding agencies such as the Global Environmental Facility and the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which are both members of the KBA partnership, can then use this information to support conservation funding decisions. So that's the carrot side of the equation. On the other side, information on KBAs is also channeled to international financing agencies, such as the International Finance Corporation. And these agencies can use this information in their safeguard policies and investment decisions. And this can provide really strong incentives to companies seeking international financing to avoid environmentally destructive impacts in these areas. And the same information is also channeled to large corporations, including those listed here, so that they can take this information into account early in the project exploration and development phase and seek to avoid environmentally destructive impacts in these areas. And I think that's really important. Having that information up front can enable companies and corporations to think about the environmental impacts well in advance before they are too far ahead in the project development process. So that's my very high level, quite rapid overview of what key biodiversity areas are. I'll now provide an overview of the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. So the global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas is a short, concise document that provides a set of definitions, criteria, thresholds, and delineation procedures for identifying key biodiversity areas in an objective, repeatable, and transparent way. KBA standard was subject to extensive consultation, as I just mentioned. This consultation process took 4 years to complete. It involved numerous technical and regional workshops, consultation with end users, 2 rounds of public consultation yielding a total of nearly 2,000 comments. And the KBA standard was then formally adopted by IUCN Council and launched alongside the Key Biodiversity Area Partnership in 2016. So the general approach taken in the standard was informed by the IUCN Red List, which uses standardized criteria and quantitative thresholds to identify threatened species. The development of the specific key biodiversity area criteria and thresholds was informed by decades of experience identifying important sites for biodiversity, so including experience with the Alliance for Zero Extinction sites, important burden biodiversity areas, Ramsar sites, etc. So most previous approaches to identifying important sites have been primarily species-based, and the KBA standard goes beyond that to identify sites that are important for ecosystems, biological processes, and ecological integrity. So the KBA standard comprises 11 criteria clustered into 5 higher level categories that identify sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of threatened biodiversity, that's group A, geographically restricted biodiversity, group B, ecological integrity, group C, biological processes, group D, and irreplaceability as determined through quantitative analysis. And I'm going to go through each of those in turn, providing a little bit more information. So sites triggering criterion A are important for globally threatened biodiversity. They hold a significant proportion of the global population of a species at risk of extinction, or a significant proportion of an ecosystem type at risk of collapse. I'm going to come back to the definition of significant in a few minutes. But you'll see here straight away with criterion A that we're looking at both threatened species and threatened ecosystem types. Sites meeting criterion B are important for biodiversity that is geographically restricted. So these sites hold a significant proportion of the global population of an individual geographically restricted species under B1, co-occurring geographically restricted species under B2, geographically restricted species assemblages, or geographically restricted ecosystem types. So again, we see the balance between species and ecosystem types. Criterion C sites have outstanding ecological integrity and maintain their full complement of species in their natural abundances or biomass. These sites are generally large enough to support the natural movement patterns of species and also to allow for the unimpeded functioning of ecological processes. And they're essentially undisturbed by significant industrial human influence. That doesn't mean that they have no human presence whatsoever. Many of these sites have been occupied for millennia, but they're undisturbed undisturbed by significant industrial human influence. Sites triggering criterion D maintain important biological processes. So D1 sites hold a significant proportion of the global population of the species during one or more life history processes, such as feeding, breeding, or migration. So these sites protect demographic aggregations. D2 sites protect environmental refugia. So these are sites where a significant proportion of a species' global population seeks refuge during periods of environmental stress, such as severe drought. So these sites may not be that important in ordinary years, but in abnormal years, they become absolutely critical to the persistence of a species population. D3 sites then are sites that produce propagules, larvae, or juveniles that maintain a significant proportion of the global adult population of a species. So we may not see many adults at the site at any one time, but without that, because that site produces such a high proportion of the juveniles that support a species, if that site disappears, the adult population would soon disappear too. And finally, under criterion E, these are sites that have a very high irreplaceability for the global persistence of biodiversity, as determined through a quantitative analysis of complementarity using techniques derived from systematic conservation planning. So these sites identified under this criterion might include sites that would not have been identified under any of the other criteria, but are nevertheless important for conserving biodiversity as a whole. So many of these criteria then include sub-criteria. So by that I mean here A1A or A1B, and these describe explicitly how the site contributes to the global persistence of biodiversity. And each criterion then has quantitative thresholds to ensure that KBA identification is objective, repeatable, and transparent. So for example, when we say that a site holds a significant proportion of a globally threatened species, then under A1A, significant is defined as 0.5% or more of the global population of a critically endangered or endangered species. Whereas under A1B, significant is defined as 1% or more of the global population of a vulnerable species. And for globally threatened species, these thresholds are very low. And the reason for this is that the super low thresholds build in a precautionary approach into the thresholds themselves. And thresholds are generally higher for other criteria that are not targeted specifically at threatened biodiversity. So for example, under B1, the threshold for individual geographically restricted species is 10% of the global population size. And all these thresholds were developed based on previous experience and through a series of technical workshops. They were refined through expert consultation and testing with data sets that covered diverse taxonomic groups, regions, and systems. So for example, thresholds for geographically restricted assemblages were tested using data sets on endemic Australian reef fishes and on Brazilian plants. So the thresholds need to work across taxa, and that's why we use percentage thresholds rather than number of individuals, because it's not possible to set numeric thresholds that would be appropriate across all taxonomic groups from, say, fungi to whales. And many of the thresholds also include a minimum number of reproductive units. This is designed to ensure that the population at the site is capable of maintaining itself beyond the current generation. So for species, the thresholds are defined in terms of the percentage of the global population size at a site. And this is measured in terms of mature individuals to account for differences in life history strategies. And the definition of mature individuals is the same as for the IUCN Red List. And it can be adapted for various different life forms, such as colonial organisms, for example. The KBA standard needs to be applicable to data-limited species as well as data-rich species. So if estimates of the number of mature individuals are not available, then there are several proxy parameters that can be used to estimate the proportion of global population size at a site. So if we don't know the number of mature individuals, we can instead look at the area of occupancy, the extent of suitable habitat, the range or number of localities. So for example, does the percentage of the area occupancy held at a site meet or exceed the threshold compared to the global area of occupancy? And distinct genetic diversity can also be used as an assessment parameter, and I won't go into that in any more detail because we're still working on including that in the guidelines. Sorry, that's the full list of assessment parameters there. And so for all sites, KBA identification also requires the recent confirmed presence at the site of the biodiversity elements that trigger key biodiversity area criteria. And that's particularly important when we're using some of those proxy parameters, because just because a site holds a significant proportion of the range of the species doesn't necessarily mean that that species occurs at the site. So we need to confirm that the species does occur at the site. And again, the reproductive units threshold is important here because it confirms that the species occurs in numbers that are sufficient for reproduction and future generations. So delineation is a required step in the KBA identification and delineation process. The aim of delineation is to derive KBA boundaries that are ecologically relevant yet practical for management. Site manageability is taken into account to enhance the prospects of biodiversity persistence at the site. So even though KBA identification doesn't imply any specific management intervention, the delineation process should aim at the very least to facilitate rather than impede future management or conservation efforts. So there's no minimum or maximum size requirement for a KBA. The size of KBA will depend on the ecological requirements of the biodiversity elements that trigger the criteria, combined with management considerations. So on land, IBAs, so important bird areas, are typically 100 to 1,000 kilometers squared, but some are much smaller and others are much larger. And the general expectation is that some marine sites may be quite a bit larger still. As I mentioned before, KBA identification and delineation is a nationally driven bottom-up process. So while we have these globally standardized criteria and thresholds to ensure that KBAs identified in one region of the world are similar, equivalent to KBAs identified in another region of the world, the process itself is very much nationally driven. Anyone can propose a KBA at any time. National coordination groups have been established in various countries to facilitate and coordinate KBA proposals, and I imagine many of you in the webinar are actually members of those coordination groups. And those coordination groups will be supported by regional focal points that can provide technical advice, training, and support. Another element I want to emphasize is consultation with a wide range of knowledge holders and involvement of rights holders, especially customary rights holders and other stakeholders, is important at various stages in the KBA identification, especially the delineation process. So now, having provided a brief high-level background and an overview of the KBA standard, now going to move on to the guidelines for using a global standard for the identification of key biodiversity areas. So in developing the KBA program, we've been very fortunate to learn from the well-established IUCN Red List process. And the KBA standard, just like the Red List categories and criteria, is a very concise document that sets out the criteria and thresholds, but doesn't provide much added detail. And hundreds, potentially thousands of people around the world are involved in Red List status assessments and will likely be involved in identifying and delineating KBAs. So the KBA guidelines, just like the Red List guidelines, provide detailed guidance on how to apply the criteria and thresholds, etc., in practice. And the aim then is to ensure that KBA identification and delineation is based on consistent and scientifically valid, yet practical methods wherever it occurs around the world. And while the KBA standard will remain the same for many years, that's important so that we can make comparisons across regions and over time. The KBA guidelines will be reviewed and updated periodically. And we expect that those updates will be mostly clarifications and additions of detail rather than substantial changes. It's important that we don't give one piece of advice one year and then turn around and give a different piece of advice the next year. Nevertheless, we really welcome feedback and suggestions on how to improve the KBA guidelines, and I'll leave you with the email address to send any feedback at the end of this presentation. So the KBA guidelines are very much designed to be used hand in hand with the KBA standard, and they're also supplemented by additional guidance on the process for proposing a site as a KBA for publication in the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. And we'll also be developing an online training course similar to that has been developed for the IUCN Red List. And we'll be compiling a set of case studies that illustrate application of the KBA criteria, thresholds, and delineation procedures. So over time, we'll be developing a lot of training materials and additional support to those who are involved in identifying and delineating KBAs. So the introduction to the KBA guidelines provides background information that's essential for applying the KBA criteria, thresholds, and delineation procedures. And I've already presented much of that information today, so I'm not going to repeat it here. But I do want to mention that we recommend that users read that introductory chapter in full before initiating any KBA identification process, because it gives a good summary of the process as a whole. The introduction is then followed by 5 chapters that provide guidelines on applying species-based criteria and their associated assessment parameters, on ecosystem-based criteria, criteria based on ecological integrity, and quantitative analysis of irreplaceability. And that last chapter is actually still in preparation. We expect to have that as part of version 2 of the guidelines, which should be published at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. So most of these chapters start with an overview section that includes a flowchart that summarizes the main steps, and then detailed guidance for each step is provided below that, including, we've adopted a frequently asked questions format, and I think that's going to be very useful in terms of making sure that the guidelines really focus on addressing specific questions. Further chapters covered the delineation procedures, stakeholder consultation and involvement, data availability, quality and uncertainty, and finally reassessment. And the aim is that all key biodiversity areas should be reassessed every 8 to 12 years to make sure that they are still support the biodiversity for which they were originally identified. So the KBA, it doesn't show up very well in this on the screen, but the KBA guidelines text is quite colorful. We have an appendix at the back with definitions of terms used in the KBA standard and the KBA guidelines. And those terms are highlighted in blue. So if you're reading the text and you see a term, you don't know what it means, but it's highlighted in blue, then you can go to the definitions at the back. And with the KBA guidelines, we'll be adding information and detail to the definitions that were already in the KBA standard. We also have a list of related documents or web resources that are available online. That's provided as an appendix, and those documents are highlighted in purple. So if you can see it there, there's a document on protected areas and how they relate to KBAs, and there's a link to that in the appendix. And then we also have an index that identifies the main sections where key terms are explained or discussed. So if you come across the term assemblage and you're not quite sure what that means, then you can have a look at Appendix 1, which is the definitions, and then it's also discussed in sections 2.61, both at the bioregion restricted assemblages and ecoregion restricted assemblages. So we've tried to make this as useful as possible. As I think you'll see through the rest of this presentation, it's very much a reference tool. It's not something that you're expected to read from cover to cover. And again, if there are suggestions on how to make it more user-friendly, then we very much welcome those suggestions. Finally, I also want to highlight that there's a handy one-page summary of all the KBA criteria and thresholds in Appendix 2. And so I think that will be very useful for people who want a quick overview of how all the different criteria and thresholds relate to each other. So in practice, we recognize that individuals and organizations that are interested in proposing KBAs will approach KBA identification in many different ways. So in some cases, we may have people who are focused on a single site. They're already involved in conserving an area and they want to know whether this site qualifies as a KBA. In other cases, we may have groups that, or individuals or groups that are interested in a particular species or maybe a whole taxonomic group. So they want to know within a country, for example, which sites would qualify as key biodiversity areas for that species or taxonomic group. And then others, especially the national coordination groups, will be interested in looking more broadly at all biodiversity elements across all sites. So we've tried to make sure that the guidelines will work for people with these different objectives in mind, but we've been particularly thinking about the steps have been identified as steps that might be useful for the national coordination groups. And we've been really encouraging the national coordination groups to conduct a comprehensive scoping analysis to identify biodiversity elements that might trigger KBAs and all potential sites that might qualify as KBAs in the country or region of interest for which there are adequate data. And so the aim of this scoping analysis is really to move beyond confirming the importance of existing sites as KBAs. That, of course, is an important objective in its own right, but we also would like to see the scoping analysis leading to the identification and delineation of sites that qualify as KBAs for biodiversity elements that may have been overlooked in previous site identification processes. So fungi, for example, in some countries, or many plant taxa may have been overlooked. Invertebrates are often overlooked, or perhaps in areas that have previously been overlooked. So in many countries, protected area designation has really focused in some regions, and other areas have had less attention. So clearly this is a huge task, and it's not possible to do this all at once. So in practice, national coordination groups or KBA proposers will likely want to start by compiling data for a few taxonomic groups in existing KBAs or in other delineated areas. However, I do really want to emphasize here that assessing sites against multiple criteria and biodiversity elements is really encouraged because it will strengthen the robustness of KBAs to changes in the status of particular trigger species or ecosystem types. So for example, if you have a site that's important for many species, but is identified as a KBA just because it's important for one globally threatened species, if that species, and so it's identified under criterion A1, that species is well conserved in many parts of its range and is delisted, so it's no longer considered threatened, then that site may no longer qualify as KBA, but in fact it may be important for many other species. And so it's important that in this process we look around to see the many different species for which a particular site is important. So I'd like to take a few minutes to walk through the KBA guidelines, focusing just by way of example on identifying KBAs for a single taxonomic group. Let's take amphibians, and focusing particularly on criterion A1 for threatened species. So if that's what we want to do, we're starting with A1. We'll start with chapter 2 on identifying KBAs using species-based criteria. And the first step in the flowchart here is to compile a list of species that could trigger criterion A1. And so section 2.2 of the KBA guidelines provides general information on identifying species that might trigger KBAs and addresses frequently asked questions about whether to include undescribed species, subspecies, migratory species, and many other questions that you might have. Section 2.3 then provides much more specific information on identifying globally threatened species that might trigger criterion A1. And this then has frequently asked questions about how to handle species that are extinct or possibly extinct in the wild, for example. And as we get more questions from users, we expect to be adding to these frequently asked questions. So the next step, once we've got our list of potential trigger species, is to ascertain the relevant thresholds for those species. And those thresholds are provided in the KBA standard, but the guidelines provide additional information on frequently asked questions, such as what is meant by effectively the entire global population size. So that is part of the threshold for A1E, for example. The next step then is to compile readily available information on the distribution of species in the region of interest. And the KBA guidelines provide suggestions on where to find this information, and we will probably be expanding that list of useful information sources as we gain more experience with the process. We can then overlay those boundaries on the boundaries of existing sites on the spatial data for each potential trigger species. And the KBA guidelines again provide suggestions on where to find GIS, so Global Information System, data on existing sites. If there are no suitable delineated sites in areas of potential importance, then we can use data on species distribution patterns to derive initial KBA boundaries. And so at this point, the scoping analysis really is complete. At this point, we should have a list of the species that might trigger criterion A1 in the region, a list of existing sites that might qualify as KBAs under criterion A1 for different species. And we may have identified areas of importance outside existing sites that merit further analysis and review. So the next two steps are to assess whether potential trigger species meet the relevant population size threshold at each existing potential site. And ideally, we would have reliable data on the number of mature individuals in the global population and in each site. But as I mentioned earlier, this information is probably won't be available for many species. So the KBA standard allows that various other assessment parameters can be used instead. So as I mentioned before, we can use area of occupancy, extent of suitable habitat, range, and number of localities. And I don't have time to go through these in detail now, but Chapter 3 of the KBA guidelines provides lots of information and addresses lots of frequently asked questions, both in terms of how to select the most appropriate assessment parameter, and then questions specific to each of the parameters. So again, a very useful reference for anyone who is trying to decide which assessment parameters to use, and then apply those to determine whether a species meets the relevant threshold of existing or potential site. So I'm going to jump ahead now to delineation. As I mentioned earlier, this is a required step in the KBA identification process. So it's typically an iterative process that involves assembling spatial data sets, mapping the distribution of trigger biodiversity elements and deriving initial boundaries based on ecological data, and then refining those ecological boundaries to yield practical KBA boundaries, so sites that are practical for management. And conveniently, the KBA Guidelines, Chapter 7, has sections on each of these steps and with lots of illustrative examples. And the examples that we have in the guidelines right now are very much, we call them cartoonified examples, so they're similar to the ones that you see on the screen. But what we would like to do is add, probably not as part of the guidelines, but separately, a number of case studies that look at real world delineation challenges and how they've been resolved. The stakeholder consultation and engagement is an essential element of the delineation process and is then covered in Chapter 8. This chapter looks at consultation with knowledge holders, so experts, whether those are in the academic world or maybe indigenous knowledge holders. It includes consensus building with proposers of existing KBAs, so an important aspect of KBA delineation is that KBAs should not overlap each other, because this makes it very hard for decision makers. And so if you identify a new KBA in a site where there's already an existing KBA, an important step in the delineation process is to consult with the proposers of the existing KBA to decide how to realign boundaries so that they're not overlapping. And again, there's a guidance on how to do that in the KBA guidelines. And finally, the Chapter 8 also covers involvement of customary rights holders. And even though KBA identification and delineation in itself does not include any steps to advance management activity, involvement of customary rights holders is recommended during the KBA identification and delineation process. because KBAs can provide the basis for future conservation and management actions. And in particular, if KBA delineation is based on Indigenous and local knowledge that hasn't been previously published, we do need to get consent on using that information before it is published. And Chapter 8 provides some useful definitions and a useful table summarizing exactly what types of consultation and involvement are either required or recommended as part of the KBA delineation process. So in conclusion, the KBA guidelines are a valuable source of information and a reference tool. The idea is not that anyone should sit down and read the document from cover to cover. Rather, we anticipate that users will turn to the KBA guidelines on an as-needed basis. And I hope that today's presentation has provided a useful overview of how to use the KBA guidelines and the type of information that can be found there. I'd like to close with some acknowledgements to acknowledge the many, many people that have been involved in developing the KBA standard, far more than can be listed here, and also the KBA guidelines. So I'd particularly like to highlight the Joint Task Force on Biodiversity and Protected Areas Committee that led the process of developing the KBA standard, and then the Key Biodiversity Area Standards and Appeals Committee that I chair, and then the Key Biodiversity Area Committee's technical working group that's chaired by Paul Donald and Penny Langhammer, both of whom spent many, many hours and days working on developing the guidelines and reviewing text. And as I mentioned before, we would very much welcome feedback from users of the KBA guidelines. We want this to be a useful tool that is clear and helpful to users. So if you have additional questions that you think need to be addressed, or there are some areas of the text that you think could be clearer, then please feel free to email me at any time. And I've included my email address here, and I'll leave that up during the discussion session. And we would especially welcome additional real-world examples and case studies that illustrate application of the KBA criteria, thresholds, and delineation procedures. So as you move through the process of identifying KBAs, then do please, if you've got interesting examples that you would like to share, then feel free to send that to the email address that's provided there. So that's all I plan to present today, but I would be very happy to answer any questions that I'm able to